Hi, welcome to week 12. We'll be covering the topic, should age or need be the basis for entitlement? There was a time in our country years ago when it was thought that older adults were impoverished, poor, in poor health, and extremely vulnerable. And in part, that was true. If you recall back to our readings in week 11, where we were talking about the social and economic outlook. And page 323 covers the list of all of the federal programs that came forward beginning in the 1930s with the Social Security Act. All of those programs, those federal initiatives, were designed around the concept that older adults need to be protected, that they're a vulnerable population, and that our country needs to do what we can to support and provide benefits for older adults so that they don't fall into a poverty situation. But a lot of that has changed. We have seen in our country the status or the economic security of older adults has increased over the years. And a part of that is because of the Social Security Act that was established in 1930s. And the Social Security Act provided for essentially a federally funded pension for older adults that once they reached the age of 65, they're still getting some form of income. We've talked about in the previous chapters about the importance of both income and wealth to older adults. And when somebody retires, they lose their income from their job. And so we need to think about then how older adults continue to live and support themselves potentially for 15 or 20 more years of their life without having that paycheck. Well, Social Security somewhat solved that problem. Anybody who lives in the United States and is a legal citizen, if they've paid into the Social Security system, they will get a pension by the time they turn 60, by the time they turn 67. So they will have a check coming through the door. So the Social Security system has allowed many older adults who would previously have been living in poverty to rise above the poverty level and live out of poverty. So the Social Security Act has gone a long way to advance the financial well-being of older adults in our country. But what we've also learned is that as a group of older adults, our society is becoming more diverse. Older adults are not all alike, and they're not all in the same bucket. We can't look at them all as a homogeneous group of people. There is variations in culture, variations in social economic status. There's minority status. And so we've talked about this concept of cumulative disadvantage or double jeopardy when an individual is a member of one or more groupings that tends to lead to a lower financial security status, such as social class and gender and race and ethnicity. So because we have such a diverse elderly population, we have a diverse group of older adults who are experiencing retirement and old age in very different ways. The book refers to the elderly and the welderly. So in addition to having some socioeconomic differences, such as I mentioned, social class and gender and race, we also have those elderly that are aging well. The welderly, they're not experiencing a lot of complicated illnesses and disabilities. And then we have the well elderly, who are the 80-year-olds who are still out on the golf course and have been living a pretty healthy, aging, time in their aging years. So we have to consider all of these diverse factors. And it's all led to this discussion about whether or not now these entitlement programs, such as Social Security and Medicare, if they really should be based on need, or do we continue to base them on age? So Social Security, as I said, it started back in the 1930s, and it's not means tested, which means that regardless of how much money you make, or how much money you have, or how much wealth you have accumulated, you are still going to get a Social Security check, whether you need it financially or not. So some of the arguments about this issue of making it means tested is that we could divert Social Security benefits from those that don't need it and give more money to people that do need it. And so in the chapter, of course, there will be articles that you're going to read, primarily reading number 34 by a writer by the name of Thoreau, Thurow, who believes that taking benefits away from older adults would actually be detrimental to the entire society, not just to older adults, but it will affect society, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But it's worth mentioning again that Social Security is the largest source of income for people over the age of 65 on average. So taking away that Social Security benefit, there is belief that there is going to be then more older adults who potentially could fall into poverty. The Medicare program is the government-backed health insurance program that started in the 1960s. And just like income, same thing when somebody stops working and they no longer are getting that paycheck, they've also lost access to their health insurance, which many of us get through our employers. So Medicare is in place of your employer-sponsored health insurance plan, and it now becomes a government insurance plan. So older adults have a source of income, and they also then have a source of health insurance, because one of the most significant factors that can help propel an older adult into financial distress is the cost of health care. So we have protections in place for older adults in that regard with the Medicare program. So as we've talked about how older adults and their financial security has actually grown and become better and more viable in our society, at the same time, we have more and more children falling into poverty. And poverty is increasing among children, and it's decreasing among older adults. Poverty in children is caused by the family structure. So you have a family with perhaps unemployment or very low socioeconomic status. And you have these families that have children, and therefore then these children also end up to be raised in a poverty situation. Poverty in children is, as I said, is increasing, and it's becoming more of a societal concern, and rightly so. But as our society is aging, attention is being turned to the massive benefits that our society is supporting older adults with, and the question is being asked, does it make sense for us anymore to carry the weight of older adults on our backs when so many of them are enjoying financial prosperity in their older years? We need to be funneling some of those resources back to children. Poverty in the elderly is found mostly among women, minorities, and those with chronic illness. Again, the elderly. And out-of-pocket medical expenses is what primarily contributes to the financial insecurity of older adults. Women are more likely to be impoverished over men. And part of the reason for that is because they are lower income earners and the prevalence of divorce. So when a couple divorces and the man is the primary breadwinner in the family, then the income to the woman is significantly changed and reduced. And if that woman has not been accustomed to working during her life, she has no other way to support herself. So divorced women can very easily fall into a state of economic crisis. So are our government programs to blame for the fact that we have more children falling into poverty? Some blame it on the fact that the voting population of older adults has kept their interests very strong and active in Washington, D.C. So politicians are very afraid to even touch the Social Security or Medicare program and make any changes to those benefits and to those entitlements because they are afraid of losing their voting bloc. So are these benefit programs a sacred cow? Are they untouchable? And you probably, if you pay attention to any of the political elections that have happened recently, you will hear both sides talking about if you elect them, they're going to change your Social Security. They're going to reduce your Medicare benefits. So even the entitlement programs become a part of the political landscape. And politicians are very aware that older adults will react very much to this idea of changing any of their benefit programs. But right now, there really, according to Moody and Sasser, there doesn't seem to be any evidence to support that the older voters are taking away resources from children, and that the real answer to that question doesn't lie in whether or not we are paying older adults too much or supporting them too much. It's that we are not using the resources of our government effectively to support children. So in other words, we don't have to take away from Peter to pay Paul. That if we were making better decisions about our government spending, children and older adults could both be better protected and protected against poverty and falling into economic distress. So the issue of equity and fairness, you'll be reading about that, reading number 37 in this chapter. And by the way, I should mention that this covers pages, I believe, 331 to 359. And reading number 37 refers to the generational equity debate. I want you to be sure that you are reading number 37 because it will be a part of a discussion board forum that we will be having, I believe it's next week. So make sure that you read that. And that is an interesting article that talks about the possibility that maybe we need to look at funding our Social Security system differently than what we do now. Now, Social Security is what's referred to as a pay-as-you-go system. So you are now paying into Social Security, and when you retire, you will be deriving some of the benefits of what you put in. But also some of the benefits that you're putting in now are going to support the future retirees. So what we have, or current retirees. So what we have now is a system of what's referred to as generational interdependence. Each generation is dependent on the other for financial support. So that's how the system has been working. That's how it started. The problem that we're running into now is that we have a difference of what is called the dependency ratio. When Social Security was first envisioned, we had a lot of workers, a lot of younger workers in our country. And so we had plenty of workers that can contribute into the system that would then support the smaller number of older retirees that were in the country at the time. But if you think back to kind of towards the beginning of our semester, when we talked about how the aging demographic is changing in our country, we are moving to a place where we have more of a rectangle, meaning that we have just as many working people as we have older people, and that rectangle is actually, or triangle is actually, the triangle is turning upside down, meaning that we are going to have fewer working people at the bottom of that triangle and more retirees. So the dependency ratio is a numeric calculation that determines what the financial impact is to the current working group to support the older adults. And back when Social Security was first envisioned, that dependency ratio was very healthy, and that it only took something like 2 workers to actually support 40 or 50 or 60 retirees. That dependency ratio is changing, where it's taking more workers to support 1 retiree. So the intergenerational equity framework is possibly not going to work any longer. So some are bringing up the idea that moving forward, each generation should take care of itself. And that's called generational equity, meaning baby boomers fund their own retirement, millennials fund their own retirement, Generation X funds their own retirement, and we don't have this interdependence going on. And like most arguments in Moody and Sasser, there are good arguments to make on both sides of this. So we haven't come to any conclusions in our country about this, but it suffices to say that nothing has changed as of yet. So in other words, your retirement that you're going to be starting to put into the bank when you start working, or putting into the Social Security fund, is actually going to be helping to support the generation in front of you, the people that are in their 40s, 30s, and 40s right now. And the people in their 30s and 40s are really supporting the people who are in their 50s and 60s and 70s. So generational interdependence. So I want you to be sure you understand the difference between interdependence and generational equity. Should we fund our own, or do we continue to rely on each other for our financial security when we become old? Now, going back to what the author, Mr. Thoreau, is stating, is that, and his reading is number 34. What he is stating is that if we take benefits away from older adults and divert more benefits to take them away from the adults and focus more of those benefits on younger children, what's going to happen there is that we will begin the slow process of impoverishing older adults to the point that it will affect their children. So their children may have to bear some of their parents' healthcare costs. It also reduces inheritance. So if you think for a moment about an older adult who's getting very little Social Security income, but let's say they have wealth. Let's say they've banked $500,000 and they've got that in savings or investments. But they have to dip into that $500,000 each month to cover their bills and their health care copays and other things that they need, their food and their medications and things that they need to live on. If they have to dip into the corpus of that wealth, that's going to decrease the inheritance that their offspring would receive down the line. So in other words, understanding the importance of income and wealth is very important. And the younger generations have more income on average than the older generation. But the older generation has more wealth. So they have accumulated wealth, but if they need that wealth to dip into it to pay their bills, that wealth is going to erode, and it will then affect the next generation, their offspring. So by not getting as much inheritance, and consequently, it could actually result in the chances of financial insecurity for their offspring. And the truth is that wealth is often created through inheritance. So my grandparents created an inheritance for my parents, who then created an inheritance for me, who will then hopefully create an inheritance for my children. And as that inheritance is passed on and on and on to the next generation, hopefully the corpus of that inheritance is not eroded. Hopefully the corpus of that inheritance is then producing the income that you need in retirement. So what Thoreau is saying is that if we now take benefits away from older adults and reduce their income, that's going to affect the corpus of their wealth, which will then down the line affect the wealth and the inheritance of future generations. So keeping older adults in good financial, not throwing them into an income problem, is where we need to keep our eye on that ball. So it's a very interesting conversation. And yet it does beg the question, for those older adults who don't need that Social Security income, should they be getting that Social Security income? I don't know that there's a right or wrong answer to that question. It's simply a very interesting debate and discussion that's taking place. So the outlook is, we know what some of the problems are. The problems are going to really be rested in our ability to fund future entitlement programs. And how are we going to do that? And how are we going to shift this dependency ratio? How are we going to ensure that we don't impoverish the current working generation to funnel so many benefits to the older adults? And how are we going to continue to address the issues of children in poverty, which is a grave, grave concern in our society? Poverty creates more poverty. So if we don't do something to try to lift these families out of poverty, we're just going to perpetuate it on and on and on. So lots of good, interesting conversations in this reading. And I want to just again reinforce that we will have a discussion board on this topic. So be thinking about intergenerational dependence and generational equity, and what your thoughts are about that, about those two things. So thank you, and you know where to find me if you have any questions. Have a good week.